The night was still and silent in the quaint town of Summit, New Jersey, as John Malfi sat alone in his dimly lit study, nursing a glass of scotch. The ticking of the grandfather clock was the only sound that pierced the heavy air, save for the occasional sigh that escaped his lips. John was a successful businessman, respected in the community, but beneath his polished exterior, a well of sorrow and regret threatened to consume him. The shrill ring of the telephone jolted him from his brooding thoughts. A cold knot of dread formed in the pit of his stomach as he reached for the receiver, already dreading the words he was about to hear. On the other end of the line, a somber voice delivered the news that would change the course of his life forever. His estranged younger brother, David, was dead. In a state of shock, John listened as the details were relayed to him. Apparent suicide, the police said, a tragedy that had unfolded in David's small apartment on the other side of town. John's hand trembled as he replaced the receiver, the glass slipping from his grasp and shattering on the hardwood floor, the amber liquid seeping into the cracks. Overcome by a torrent of emotions, John paced the room, his mind racing to make sense of the devastating news. Grief, guilt, and a sense of profound regret washed over him in equal measure. How had it come to this? He and David had been close as children, but over the years, a chasm had grown between them, fueled by unresolved conflicts and bitter resentments. Now, with David gone, John was left to grapple with the weight of their unfinished business, the missed opportunities, and the haunting question of whether he could have done more to prevent this tragedy. Steeling himself, he made a silent vow to uncover the truth behind his brother's death, no matter the cost. Donning his coat, John stepped out into the chill of the night, his footsteps echoing against the empty streets as he made his way to the police station. The investigation had begun, and in its wake, a reckoning with his own past was about to unfold. The next morning, John arrived at the police station, his eyes bloodshot and his expression grim. He was ushered into a small, nondescript office where Detective Eleanor waited, her brow furrowed with concern. "Mr. Malfi, I'm so sorry for your loss," Eleanor said, gesturing for him to take a seat. "I know this must be an incredibly difficult time for you." John nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Thank you, Detective. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Can you tell me what you know so far about my brother's death?" Eleanor clasped her hands on the desk, her gaze steady. "From the preliminary investigation, it appears to have been a suicide. David was found in his apartment, with no signs of struggle or foul play. The medical examiner is still processing the scene, but the initial evidence points to an intentional overdose." John's brow furrowed, his fingers drumming against the arm of the chair. "That doesn't sound like my brother. David had his struggles, but he was never the type to." His voice trailed off, the unspoken implication hanging in the air. "I understand your skepticism, Mr. Malfi," Eleanor replied, her tone measured. "That's why I'd like to ask you a few questions about your relationship with David, if you're up for it. The more we know about his state of mind and the circumstances leading up to this, the better we can piece together what happened." John hesitated, his gaze drifting towards the window. "I haven't spoken to David in years, Detective. We had a falling out, and our relationship was strained, to say the least." He paused, a flicker of pain crossing his features. "I suppose I should have tried harder to mend those wounds, but..." He shook his head, the unfinished sentence lingering. Eleanor nodded sympathetically. "I see. Can you tell me more about the nature of your falling out? What led to the rift between you and your brother?" John let out a heavy sigh, his fingers running through his graying hair. "It's a long story, Detective, and not one I'm proud of. but I suppose if I'm to help you get to the bottom of this, I owe you the truth." He took a moment to collect his thoughts, then began to speak, his voice tinged with regret. "It all started with a business deal gone wrong. David and I had partnered on a project, but things quickly spiraled out of control. There were accusations, lawsuits, and eventually, a bitter fallout that severed our relationship." John paused, his gaze hardening. "I'm ashamed to admit that I let my pride and anger get the better of me. I said things, did things, that I can never take back." Eleanor listened intently, her pen poised over her notepad. "And after that, you and David never reconciled?" "No," John replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I tried, at first, but David, he was never one to let go of a grudge. And well, I was too stubborn to make the first move." He shook his head, a mirthless smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Ironic, isn't it, that the one time I should have swallowed my pride, I didn't, and now I may have to live with that regret for the rest of my life." The weight of his words hung in the air, as both John and Eleanor grappled with the gravity of the situation. After a moment of silence, Eleanor reached across the desk, giving John's hand a gentle squeeze. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Melfi, but I promise you, we're going to get to the bottom of this. I won't rest until we uncover the full truth about what happened to your brother." John looked up, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Thank you, Detective. I appreciate your dedication, and I'm ready to do whatever it takes to find out what really happened." The following day, John found himself back at the police station, this time joined by Detective Eleanor, as they began the arduous task of piecing together the details surrounding David's death. The air was thick with purpose, but also a palpable tension as the two set out to uncover the truth. "All right, Mr. Melfi," Eleanor began, settling into her chair and fixing John with a determined gaze. "Let's start from the beginning. Tell me everything you can remember about your last interactions with your brother." John took a deep breath, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's been years since I last saw David, Detective. I'm afraid I don't have much to go on." He paused, his fingers drumming against the arm of his chair. "The last time we spoke was shortly after our business deal fell apart. It was a messy situation, to say the least." Eleanor nodded, her pen poised over her notepad. "Can you elaborate on that? What exactly happened with this business deal?" John shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It was a real estate development project that we had partnered on. We both invested a significant amount of money, but things quickly went downhill. There were accusations of mismanagement, financial discrepancies, and eventually, a bitter legal battle that tore our family apart." "I see," Eleanor murmured, jotting down a few notes. "And during this time, did you notice any changes in your brother's behavior or mental state?" John's gaze drifted towards the window, his expression pensive. "To be honest, Detective, I wasn't really paying attention. I was too consumed by my own anger and resentment to see the bigger picture." He paused, a hint of regret coloring his tone. "If I had just reached out, tried to understand what he was going through." Eleanor reached across the desk, placing a reassuring hand on John's arm. "Don't be too hard on yourself, Mr. Melfi. Hindsight is always 20/20. What's important now is that we focus on uncovering the truth." John nodded, his jaw set with determination. "You're right. I'm ready to do whatever it takes to find out what really happened to my brother." Encouraged by John's resolve, Eleanor continued, "All right, then let's start by going through David's personal effects and financial records. Maybe we can find some clues that will shed light on his state of mind in the months leading up to his death." "Of course," John replied, rising from his seat. "I'll do anything I can to help. His voice trailed off, a flicker of emotion crossing his face. "I just hope I'm not too late to make things right." Eleanor gave him a sympathetic look. "We'll do our best, Mr. Malfi. I promise you, we'll leave no stone unturned." With a nod, John followed the detective out of the office, his mind already racing with 1,000 questions and a renewed determination to uncover the truth, no matter where it led. As the investigation progressed, John found himself consumed by an all-consuming need to uncover the truth behind his brother's death. He spent long hours poring over David's financial records, phone logs, and personal belongings, searching for any clue that might shed light on the circumstances surrounding the tragedy. The strain of his obsession began to take a toll on his relationship with his wife, Victoria. One evening, as he hunched over his laptop, his brow furrowed in concentration, Victoria entered the study, her expression a mix of concern and exasperation. "John, you need to take a break," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You've been holed up in here for hours, and you look exhausted." John looked up, his eyes weary. "I can't, Victoria. Not when I'm so close to finding out what really happened to David." Victoria moved closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I know you're driven to get to the bottom of this, but you can't let it consume you. It's not healthy, and it's starting to worry me." John sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I have to do this, Victoria. I owe it to David, to our family, to find out the truth. I let him down once before, and I can't bear the thought of failing him again." Victoria's gaze softened, and she pulled up a chair, sitting beside him. "Darling, I understand your need for answers, but you can't keep pushing yourself like this. You're starting to neglect your own well-being, and that's not fair to you or to me." John looked into her eyes, his expression conflicted. "I'm sorry, Victoria. I don't mean to shut you out, but this has become an obsession. I can't rest until I know what really happened to David." Victoria reached out, taking his hand in hers. "I know, and I want to support you, but you have to take care of yourself too. Please, John, for my sake, for our sake, try to find a balance." John squeezed her hand, a tiny smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're right, as always. I'll try, I promise. But you have to understand, this is something I have to see through, for David, and for myself." Victoria nodded, leaning in to press a gentle kiss to his cheek. "I know, and I'm with you, every step of the way. Just don't forget to take care of the living, okay?" John pulled her into a tight embrace, feeling the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. "Okay," he whispered, his heart swelling with gratitude for his steadfast companion. As they held each other, the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future seemed to fade away, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose and the unshakable bond that had sustained them through even the darkest of times. As John and Detective Eleanor delved deeper into the investigation, they began to uncover a web of deceit and betrayal that shook the very foundation of David's life. Poring over the financial records, they discovered that David had been involved in a high-stakes business scandal that had cost several people their life savings. The revelations were jarring, challenging the image of David that John had carried in his mind for so long. This is unbelievable," John muttered, his hands trembling as he reviewed the documents spread out before him on the desk. "My brother, involved in something like this?" Eleanor nodded solemnly, her brow furrowed with concentration. "I know this must be difficult for you to process, Mr. Malfi, but the evidence is clear. Your brother was at the center of a major financial fraud." John ran a hand through his hair, his expression a mix of disbelief and anguish. "I just can't wrap my head around it. David, the David I knew, he would never. How could he do this?" "That's what we need to find out," Eleanor replied, her tone measured. Was he the mastermind behind this scheme, or was he perhaps a victim himself? We need to follow the trail and see where it leads. John nodded, his jaw set with determination. Then let's do it. I need to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Their investigation led them to David's business partner, Liam, a slick and charismatic figure who had seemingly orchestrated the entire operation. When confronted, Liam's demeanor shifted from one of feigned innocence to outright defiance. "This is all just a misunderstanding," Liam insisted, his eyes narrowing. "David and I were partners, yes, but I had no idea about the shady dealings going on behind the scenes. He must have been acting alone." John's jaw tightened, his patience wearing thin. "I find that hard to believe, Liam. The evidence clearly implicates you as well. You're going to have to do a lot better than that." Liam's lips curved into a sardonic smile. "Well, Mr. Malfi, it's your word against mine. And let's not forget, your brother is no longer here to defend himself. So, I'm afraid you're going to have a hard time proving anything." Eleanor stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "We have our ways of finding the truth, Mr. Liam. I can assure you, we won't stop until we uncover every last detail of this scheme, no matter whose reputation is at stake." The air in the room grew tense as the three of them squared off, each determined to protect their own interests. John could feel the walls closing in, the weight of the revelations bearing down on him, but he refused to back down, driven by a relentless need to uncover the full scope of his brother's betrayal. As the investigation continued, John found himself grappling with a growing moral dilemma. The deeper he and Detective Eleanor delved into the details of David's involvement in the financial scandal, the more conflicted he became about the course of action they should take. One evening, after a particularly tense exchange with Liam, John and Eleanor retreated to a quiet cafe to discuss their next steps. "I'm not sure I can go through with this, Eleanor," John said, his brow furrowed with worry. "Exposing the full truth about David's actions will ruin his reputation, and it'll hurt a lot of innocent people in the process." Eleanor regarded him steadily, her expression sympathetic. "I understand your hesitation, John, but we have a responsibility to the victims of this fraud to see justice done, no matter how unpleasant it may be." John shook his head, his fingers drumming against the tabletop. I know, but David was my brother, and as much as I'm disgusted by what he's done, I can't help but feel torn." "I realize this isn't an easy decision," Eleanor replied, reaching across the table to give his hand a gentle squeeze. "But sometimes, doing the right thing comes at a personal cost. Are you prepared to live with the consequences of burying the truth?" John let out a heavy sigh, his gaze drifting towards the window. "I don't know, Eleanor. I want justice, but I also want to protect my family's legacy. David and we had our differences, but he was still my brother." Eleanor nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I understand, John, but if you don't hold him accountable, where does that leave the people he hurt? The ones who lost their life savings because of his actions?" John's jaw tightened, and he ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "You're right, of course. It's so damn hard. I feel like I'm being pulled in two different directions." "I know," Eleanor said, her voice soft, "but you have to ask yourself, what would David have wanted? What's the honorable thing to do, even if it's the most difficult path forward?" John fell silent, his gaze downcast as he grappled with the weight of the decision before him. After a long moment, he looked up, his eyes resolute. "I have to do what's right, even if it means tarnishing David's name. The victims deserve justice, and I can't be the one to deny them that, no matter how painful it might be." Eleanor offered him a small, sympathetic smile. "I'm proud of you, John. I know this isn't easy, but you're doing the right thing. We'll get through this together." John nodded, his expression somber. "I hope so, Eleanor. I hope so." As they sat in the quiet cafe, the magnitude of the choice they had made seemed to hang in the air, a heavy burden that John knew he would have to carry with him, no matter where the investigation led. As the investigation progressed, the strain between John and Detective Eleanor began to grow more evident. While they had started out as unlikely allies, united in their pursuit of the truth, the emotional toll of the case and the complex ethical dilemmas they faced began to take a toll on their partnership. One particularly heated exchange took place in the cramped confines of Eleanor's office, as they debated their next course of action. "We can't keep delaying this, John," Eleanor said, her brow furrowed with frustration. "The victims deserve to know the full extent of David's involvement in this scam. We have a moral obligation to see this through." John paced the room, his hands clenched into fists. "I know, Eleanor, I know. But you have to understand, this isn't just some cold case to me. This is my brother's legacy we're talking about. I can't just disregard that." Eleanor sighed, her expression softening. "I know this is personal for you, John, but you have to set aside your personal feelings and focus on the bigger picture here. Justice has to be served, regardless of the consequences." "But at what cost, Eleanor?" John retorted, his voice rising. "You want me to destroy my brother's reputation, to ruin the lives of everyone he was connected to. How is that justice?" "It's not about what's convenient, John," Eleanor replied, her tone firm. "It's about doing what's right, even when it's the hardest thing to do. These people were betrayed, and they deserve to know the truth." John ran a hand through his hair, his expression anguished. "I understand that, I really do. But I can't help feeling like I'm betraying my own brother in the process. Isn't there another way, a middle ground we can find?" Eleanor shook her head, her gaze unwavering. "I wish there was, John, but the evidence is clear, and we have a responsibility to the victims to see this through. Anything less would be a disservice to them." The two fell silent, the tension palpable in the air. John could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on him, the conflicting loyalties tearing him apart. Finally, he spoke, his voice tinged with resignation. "All right, Eleanor, we'll do it your way. But I want you to know, this isn't going to be easy for me." Eleanor reached across the desk, placing a hand on his arm. "I know, John, but I'm here for you, every step of the way. We'll get through this together." John nodded, his jaw set with determination, even as a deep sense of unease settled in the pit of his stomach. As they set out to expose the full truth, he couldn't help but wonder if the cost of justice would be higher than he was willing to bear. As the investigation reached its climax, John found himself standing before a packed courtroom, his heart pounding in his chest. Beside him, Detective Eleanor stood with an unwavering determination, their partnership strained but still intact. They had laid bare the sordid details of David's involvement in the financial scandal, exposing the web of deceit and betrayal that had rocked the community. The victims, once betrayed and robbed of their life savings, now sat in the gallery, their faces etched with a mix of anger, relief, and vindication. John's gaze swept across the room, his eyes landing on Liam, who sat with a veneer of composure, his lawyer arguing fervently on his behalf. But John knew the truth, and he was resolved to see this through, no matter the personal cost. When it was his turn to take the stand, John felt a familiar sense of dread wash over him, but this time there was a steely determination in his eyes, a resolve that had been forged in the crucible of his grief and the pursuit of justice. "Mr. Melfi," the prosecutor began, his voice measured, "can you tell the court about your relationship with your brother David?" John swallowed hard, his fingers gripping the edge of the witness box. David and I, we were once very close, but over the years our relationship became strained due to a business deal that went sour. He paused, his gaze drifting towards the gallery. I regret that I was not able to reconcile with him before his passing. The prosecutor nodded, his expression sympathetic. And what can you tell us about your brother's involvement in the financial fraud that cost so many people their life savings? John took a deep breath, his voice steady. The evidence is clear. David was a key player in this scheme, working in tandem with his business partner Liam to swindle innocent investors out of their hard-earned money. A hush fell over the courtroom as John's words hung in the air, the gravity of the revelation weighing heavily on all present. The prosecutor pressed on, his tone grave. "And how did you come to uncover this information, Mr. Malfi? What motivated you to pursue the truth, even when it meant exposing the dark secrets of your own family?" John's jaw tightened, his gaze unwavering. "I owed it to the victims, to my brother, and to myself to find out the truth. No matter how painful it might be, justice had to be served." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the weight of John's words resonating with all who heard them. As he stepped down from the witness stand, John felt a profound sense of relief and a glimmer of hope that perhaps some measure of redemption could be found in the ashes of this tragedy. In the weeks that followed the trial, John found himself grappling with a complex web of emotions. The revelations about David's involvement in the financial scandal had rocked him to his core, shattering the idealized image he had carried of his brother for so long. Yet, as the dust settled, John couldn't help but feel a sense of profound loss and regret. Despite their differences, David had been his flesh and blood, and the realization that he would never have the chance to make amends weighed heavily on his heart. One evening, as John sat alone in his study, lost in contemplation, Victoria entered the room, her expression etched with concern. "John, are you all right?" she asked, her voice soft. John looked up, his eyes weary. "I'm not sure, Victoria. I keep trying to make sense of all of this, but the more I think about it, the more I feel like I've failed David in the worst possible way." Victoria moved closer, taking a seat beside him. "Darling, you couldn't have known what was happening. You were just trying to uncover the truth, to find justice for the victims." John sighed, his fingers drumming against the arm of his chair. "I know, but that doesn't make it any easier. David was my brother, and I let him down when he needed me most." Victoria reached out, taking his hand in hers. "You can't blame yourself, John. David made his own choices that hurt a lot of innocent people. As difficult as it is, you had to do what was right, even if it meant exposing the truth about him." John nodded, his gaze drifting towards the window. "I know, and I don't regret that, but I can't help but wonder if there was something more I could have done, some way I could have saved him from himself." Victoria squeezed his hand, her expression sympathetic. "You can't change the past, John, but you can honor David's memory by using this experience to make a positive difference in the lives of others." John looked at her, a glimmer of understanding dawning in his eyes. "You're right, Victoria. I can't undo what's been done, but maybe I can find a way to turn this tragedy into something meaningful." Inspired by his wife's words, John rose from his seat, a newfound sense of purpose in his step. "I'm going to start a foundation, one that helps protect investors and educate the public about financial fraud. It's the least I can do to make amends for what David and Liam have done." Victoria smiled, pride shining in her eyes. "That's a wonderful idea, John. I know it won't be easy, but I'll be here to support you every step of the way." John pulled her into a tight embrace, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Victoria. I don't know what I'd do without you." As they held each other, John felt a weight lift from his shoulders, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose, and a determination to honor his brother's memory in the only way he could, by ensuring that no one else would have to suffer the same betrayal and heartbreak. Now, as John stands at the precipice of this new chapter, he can't help but wonder, what lessons can we learn from this tragedy, and how can we use them to build a more just and compassionate world? The answer, he knows, lies not just in the pursuit of justice, but in the power of forgiveness, redemption, and the unwavering strength of the human spirit.